The war was not misunderstood. That is the comfortable version, the one that allows for the possibility that if people had simply been given more information, clearer pictures, more accurate maps, the whole enterprise might have gone differently. The truth is closer to this. The war was misrepresented, deliberately and systematically, at every level, from the squad leader filling out after-action reports in the mud to the generals briefing the Secretary of Defense in air-conditioned rooms in Saigon. And the misrepresentation was not a failure of communication. It was the product of a system that had decided, somewhere along the line, that the appearance of progress was more valuable than progress itself. Once that decision was made, everything downstream from it became corrupted in ways that were quiet, incremental, and very difficult to reverse. You have to understand what the war looked like from the outside, from the television screens in American living rooms, before you can understand how different it looked from the inside. On television, it was a series of operations with names, firefights with body counts, generals with confident voices, and a continuous upward trend in almost every statistical category that was supposed to indicate success. Enemy killed, hamlets pacified, roads secured, infiltration routes interdicted. The numbers moved in the right direction, month after month, and the people reporting them were not lying in the simple sense of saying things they knew to be false. Many of them believed, or had trained themselves to believe, that the numbers were meaningful. What the television never showed was the machinery that produced the numbers, because the machinery was the problem, and the machinery was invisible. The body count was the central fact of the Vietnam War, the metric around which everything else organized itself, and it was broken almost from the beginning. The logic behind it seemed reasonable on its surface. In a war without front lines, without territorial objectives in the traditional sense, the most reliable indicator of progress was the rate at which you were degrading the enemy's capacity to fight. If you killed enough of them fast enough, eventually they would not be able to sustain the effort. This was the theory of attrition, and it was not an unreasonable theory. What was unreasonable was the assumption that the body count could accurately measure progress toward the theory's objective. The count was taken by the units that did the killing, reported up a chain of command that rewarded high numbers, and verified by no independent mechanism. There was no system for checking the counts against anything real. There were no neutral observers in the field. There were no Vietnamese officials with access to enemy records who could confirm or contradict the figures. There was only the number that the unit commander wrote down and sent up the chain, and the pressure, almost universally felt, to make that number as high as possible. The pressure was not always explicit. Commanding officers did not always sit their junior officers down and say, "Inflate your body count, or your career will suffer." They did not have to. The culture communicated the message clearly enough through promotion patterns, through the tone of after-action briefings, through the questions that senior officers asked when they visited the field. The question was almost always some version of "how many did you get?" and the answer to that question determined how the visit went, how the report was written, how the officer was evaluated. The question almost never was, "How accurately do you think your count reflects actual enemy dead?" That question, if asked, would have been considered strange, would have marked the asker as someone who did not understand how the war worked. And so the counts inflated, year after year, and the total accumulated enemy dead eventually exceeded the total number of people who had been in the enemy force at the start of the war by a significant margin. And this was not treated as evidence that the count was wrong. It was treated as evidence that the enemy had been continuously reinforced. There was a name for this inside the military. It was called the crossover point, and it was always being predicted and never being reached. The crossover point was the moment when American forces would be killing the enemy faster than the enemy could be replaced, the moment when attrition would begin to work, the moment when the trend lines would finally intersect and the war would begin to end. Analysts predicted it repeatedly throughout the mid-1960s. General William Westmoreland, who commanded American forces in Vietnam from 1964 to 1968, believed deeply in the concept, and his requests for additional troops were always premised on the idea that with just a few more divisions, the crossover point could be achieved within a year, perhaps two. The troop levels increased from around 23,000 in 1964 to more than 500,000 by 1968, and the crossover point remained a future event, always approaching, never arriving. What was happening on the ground during those years was something very different from what the statistics described. The enemy was not being degraded toward strategic incapacity. The enemy was adapting, withdrawing from engagements that were too costly, dispersing into the population, replacing casualties from recruitment pools in the north and from the villages of the south, and maintaining a tempo of operations that the body count numbers, if taken at face value, should have made impossible. The enemy fought at a time and place of their choosing, avoided large-scale engagements when they could, and inflicted steady casualties on American forces through mines, booby traps, small ambushes, and rocket attacks on bases. The war was not going the way the numbers said it was going. The soldiers in the field knew this with the certainty of people who had walked the same ground multiple times, watched the same villages be cleared and then re-infiltrated, watched the same roads be swept and then mined again the following morning. They knew the war was not progressing. But their reports said it was progressing because that was what the system required the reports to say. The Hamlet pacification program is worth examining in some detail because it illustrates how completely the gap between official reality and actual reality could become institutionalized. The program, which went through several iterations and names over the course of the war, was premised on the idea that the key to defeating the insurgency was not military attrition, but political control of the rural population. If the government of South Vietnam could demonstrate to the peasants of the countryside that it was capable of providing security, justice, and basic services, the argument went, those peasants would withdraw their support from the Viet Cong, and the insurgency would wither for lack of the popular base it needed to survive. This was a sophisticated analysis, and it reflected genuine understanding of the nature of the conflict. The problem was the measurement system used to track progress toward its goals. The system was called the Hamlet Evaluation System, and it generated monthly reports on the security status of every hamlet in South Vietnam. Each hamlet was rated on a scale from A to E, with A representing full government control and E representing full enemy control. And the reports aggregated these ratings into national statistics that were then briefed to officials in Saigon and Washington as indicators of whether pacification was working. The problem, again, was who was doing the rating. The ratings were produced by American advisors and South Vietnamese officials who were operating under the same pressure to show progress that afflicted every other part of the reporting system. A hamlet that was rated B or C rather than A was a hamlet that reflected poorly on the advisor responsible for it. A hamlet that was rated D or E was a potential career problem. And so the ratings drifted upward. Hamlets were reclassified as more secure than they actually were, and the national statistics showed a steady improvement in pacification that bore little relationship to the actual security of the countryside. The gap between the rated security and the actual security was sometimes staggering. Hamlets classified as A or B were, in some cases, regularly attacked at night, contained known Viet Cong sympathizers, and had local officials who were themselves providing intelligence to the insurgency. The American advisor would rate the hamlet as secure because it had not been overrun, because the village chief showed up for meetings, because there was a government school operating during daylight hours. The Viet Cong would rate it as contested or theirs, because they collected taxes there at night, because the young men who showed up for South Vietnamese militia training also attended Viet Cong political meetings, because the village's real loyalties were distributed in ways that no hamlet evaluation form could capture. The American measurement system was measuring a surface that bore no reliable relationship to the underlying reality. The soldiers who rotated through the villages and hamlets during search and clear operations understood the gap intuitively, even when they could not articulate it precisely. They had the experience of clearing the same village 3 or 4 times, of finding the same caches of rice and weapons in roughly the same hiding places, of receiving the same blank-faced cooperation from villagers who answered questions without volunteering information, who pointed toward known trails when asked about Viet Cong movement and away from the actual trails being used. They had the experience of walking out of a village that had been declared pacified, and hearing the sound of small arms fire from behind them before they were a kilometer away. They understood that the word pacified was a word that existed in reports, not in the field. The nature of the enemy they were fighting compounded the disorientation. The Viet Cong were not, for the most part, an alien force that had invaded from outside the society. They were the society, or a substantial part of it. And distinguishing them from non-combatants was a problem that the American military never solved and largely stopped trying to solve in any rigorous way. The rules of engagement that governed when soldiers could fire, who they could target, what counted as a hostile act, were the subject of constant revision and constant violation. And the violations were not systematically punished, because punishing them would have required acknowledging how widespread they were. The rules said that civilians were not to be targeted. The reality was that in many areas of heavy Viet Cong activity, the distinction between civilian and combatant had ceased to have operational meaning. A farmer who tended his fields by day and carried supplies for the Viet Cong by night was both things simultaneously, and the American soldier who had to decide in the fraction of a second available for such decisions whether to fire at the figure crossing the tree line at dusk had no reliable way to determine which category applied. The free fire zone was the formal institutionalization of this collapse of categories. Designated areas of the country were declared free fire zones, meaning that any person found within them was assumed to be an enemy combatant and could be engaged without further justification. The designation was meant to resolve the problem of distinguishing combatants from civilians by the simple expedient of declaring that everyone in the designated area was a combatant. What this meant in practice was that civilians who had not been evacuated or who had returned to their villages after evacuation because they had nowhere else to go could be killed legally, and their deaths could be counted in the body count as enemy dead. The free fire zone made the body count easier to accumulate and harder to evaluate, and the people who died within them were, in many cases, not combatants in any meaningful sense of the word. The villages of the Mekong Delta and the coastal lowlands were home to families who had lived in those places for generations, who had ancestors buried in the nearby paddies, who had no political affiliation more profound than the desire to grow enough rice to feed their children. They found themselves, through no choice of their own, in the middle of a war that neither side could explain to their satisfaction, subjected to pressure from the Viet Cong to provide support, and to pressure from the Americans and the South Vietnamese government to demonstrate loyalty, and punished by both sides for insufficient enthusiasm. The American soldiers who moved through their villages were, in most cases, young men from places so different from the Delta that the entire landscape registered as alien, threatening, and incomprehensible. The heat, the language, the food, the social arrangements, the physical environment, all of it was unlike anything they had been prepared for, and their preparedness, such as it was, had focused heavily on the mechanics of killing rather than on the sociology of the population they were supposed to be protecting. The average age of the American combat soldier in Vietnam was 19 years old. This is a number that appears in histories of the war with some regularity, but its implications are not always examined carefully. A 19-year-old from rural Georgia or industrial Ohio, drafted into the army and given roughly 16 weeks of training before being placed in the Mekong Delta, was not equipped to make nuanced judgments about the political loyalties of Vietnamese villagers, to distinguish between productive and counterproductive applications of force, or to maintain the psychological distance necessary to remain within the rules of engagement under conditions of fear and exhaustion and grief. He was not uniquely incapable of these things because of any personal deficiency. He was incapable of them because the task was genuinely beyond what any person could be trained to do in 16 weeks, and because the conditions under which he was asked to perform the task were designed to make any kind of careful judgment nearly impossible. The one-year tour of duty was a policy decision that had profound and largely unexamined consequences for unit cohesion, institutional knowledge, and the psychology of individual soldiers. The Army decided, early in the build-up, to rotate soldiers through Vietnam on individual 12-month tours rather than keeping units together for the duration of the war, as had been done in previous conflicts. The reasoning was partly humanitarian, in the sense that it was designed to ensure that no individual soldier would bear an unlimited share of the combat burden, and partly practical, in that it allowed the Army to distribute the Vietnam experience broadly across its officer and non-commissioned officer corps, ensuring that a large number of people accumulated relevant experience. What the policy produced in practice was a continuous state of institutional amnesia. Units were never stable. The soldiers in a given company were at all times at various stages of their tour, and the institutional knowledge accumulated by those who had been in country longest departed with them when their rotation ended, leaving the newcomers to learn from their own mistakes rather than from accumulated collective wisdom. The unit that had learned the hard way which trails were mined in a given operational area, which villages were reliably hostile, which local informants could be trusted, was never the same unit the following month, and the lessons had to be relearned continuously, and the relearning sometimes cost lives. The psychological effect of the individual rotation on the soldiers themselves was corrosive in ways that were not fully understood until much later. The 12-month tour created a particular relationship to time, in which the soldier's primary objective was to survive long enough to leave. This is different from the psychology of a soldier committed to fighting until the war was over, because the war's end was not a prospect that could be predicted, and the soldier who oriented his mental life around the war's end was orienting it around something that might never come. The individual rotation substituted a personal endpoint for the absent collective one, and it focused the soldier's attention and energy on personal survival rather than on mission success in any larger sense. Short-timers, soldiers in the last weeks of their tour, were notoriously reluctant to take risks, notoriously reluctant to go on patrols, notoriously protective of the time they had left to wait. The tour created a particular calendar psychology in which the days were marked off, and the number remaining was tracked obsessively, and this psychology, while entirely understandable, was not compatible with the kind of sustained commitment to mission that the war's conduct required. The drug use that became widespread in the late 1960s and early 1970s was one of the clearest indicators of how badly the institutional and psychological structures of the war had broken down, and it was almost entirely absent from the television coverage of the period. Marijuana had been available in Vietnam since the early years of the American build-up, and its use had been a disciplinary problem from the beginning, but the scale of the problem increased dramatically after 1968, and by the early 1970s, the use of marijuana, heroin, and other substances had reached levels that were functionally incompatible with military effectiveness. The Army's own studies, conducted internally and largely kept from public view, found that heroin use alone affected a substantial fraction of American troops in Vietnam by 1971, with some estimates running to 20% or higher of the combat force. These were not estimates derived from voluntary self-reporting, which would have understated the problem. They were derived from urine testing programs that were introduced and then modified and then partly discontinued as the scale of the problem became clear and the question of what to do about it became politically complicated. The heroin available in Vietnam was of a quality far higher than anything available on the streets of American cities, and it was cheap and it was accessible. It arrived through networks that were entangled with the South Vietnamese military and government in ways that the American command structure was aware of, but did not address with any consistency or determination, partly because addressing it would have required confronting the corruption of the institutions the United States was there to support, and confronting that corruption would have undermined the political narrative that American involvement was enabling a legitimate and capable South Vietnamese state to defend itself. The heroin networks were therefore allowed to operate within limits that were rarely enforced, and the soldiers who used the drug were, for the most part, treated as disciplinary problems rather than as symptoms of a larger failure of the institution. The fragging, the term for the deliberate killing of officers and non-commissioned officers by their own men, was perhaps the clearest possible indicator of the breakdown of military discipline and unit cohesion, and it too was almost entirely absent from the mainstream press coverage of the war. The practice took its name from the fragmentation grenade, which was frequently the weapon used, partly because it was readily available, and partly because it left physical evidence that was difficult to distinguish from the results of enemy action. The Army tracked fragging incidents in its criminal records, but the data was not made public, and the total number of confirmed incidents was likely far smaller than the actual number, because incidents that could be attributed to enemy action were often not investigated as potential fraggings, and the investigation of potential fraggings within a unit created problems for that unit's commanding officers that many preferred to avoid. The estimates that have emerged from historical research suggest that between 1969 and 1971, there was somewhere in the range of 600 to 800 confirmed or suspected fragging incidents, resulting in the deaths of roughly 80 to 90 officers and non-commissioned officers. The actual number was almost certainly higher, because the definition of fragging used in official records excluded some categories of incidents that shared the same essential character: the killing of a superior by subordinates unwilling to follow his orders, even when they did not involve fragmentation grenades. The soldiers who committed these acts were not, in the main, sociopaths or criminals in the conventional sense. They were, in many cases, men who had made a calculation that their commanding officer's orders were likely to get them killed for no discernible purpose, and who had decided that killing the commanding officer was preferable to following the orders. This is a calculation that implies a complete collapse of the moral and institutional framework that makes military organizations function. It implies that the soldiers involved had concluded that the institution they were part of had lost the moral authority to command their obedience, and that their own survival was a more compelling obligation than their duty to the chain of command. The officers who were fragged were not uniformly bad officers, though some of them certainly were. Some were men who had simply pushed their units too hard, demanded too much exposure to risk for objectives that the men could not see were worth the cost. Others were rigid disciplinarians in units where the rules they were enforcing had come to seem divorced from any rational purpose. In a few cases, the fragged officer was a man of genuine competence and integrity who had made enemies through no particular fault. The pattern, such as it was, pointed less to individual officer failure than to a systemic failure of the institution to maintain the relationship between command authority and moral legitimacy that makes military discipline voluntary rather than coerced. The South Vietnamese Army, the institution that American policy was premised on building into a capable force that could eventually take over the defense of its own country, was a subject of almost unbroken optimism in official briefings, and almost unbroken pessimism among the Americans who worked with it in the field. The policy, which came to be called Vietnamization under the Nixon administration, was premised on the idea that the South Vietnamese were capable of assuming the combat burden if given sufficient training, equipment, and time. The Americans who served as advisors to South Vietnamese units understood, with few exceptions, that this premise was not being met. The South Vietnamese Army had endemic problems with officer quality, with corruption in the logistics chain, with desertion, with the political loyalty of its soldiers, and with the fundamental question of whether its men were willing to fight with the intensity and persistence that the war required. These problems were documented in advisor reports that were sent up the chain of command, and in many cases softened or set aside before reaching the level where policy decisions were made. The desertion rate in the South Vietnamese army was, by most periods of the war, higher than the casualty rate. More men were leaving the army voluntarily than were being killed by the enemy, and the ones who left were not typically replaced by men of equal motivation and capability. The deserters went home to their villages, or they went to cities where they could find economic opportunities that the army could not provide, or in some cases, they went to the Viet Cong. The ones who stayed were often there because the army was the only reliable source of income for their families, which meant that their commitment to the institution was economic rather than political or military, and could be expected to dissolve under conditions of prolonged stress or when a better economic option appeared. This was not a characterization invented by critics of the war. It was the private assessment of most American advisors who spent sustained periods with South Vietnamese units, and it was the subject of internal reports that were classified and not released to the public for years after the war ended. The question of torture is one of the most consistently underreported aspects of the war, in part because it was one of the most consistently widespread. The abuse of prisoners and detainees was not a peripheral feature of the American and South Vietnamese war effort. It was central to the intelligence-gathering enterprise on which so much of the counterinsurgency strategy depended. The Phoenix program, which was designed to identify and neutralize the Viet Cong infrastructure in the villages, depended for much of its effectiveness on the extraction of information from captured suspects, and the methods used to extract that information ranged from psychological pressure through physical abuse to what would be described, without qualification, as torture. Prisoners were subjected to electric shock, to simulated drowning, to beating, to sensory deprivation, and to other methods whose details appear in the internal reports of American advisors and in the testimony of Vietnamese survivors with enough consistency to suggest that they were not aberrations, but standard practice. The Phoenix program itself was a significant subject of public controversy during and after the war, but the controversy focused primarily on the program's kill statistics, on the question of how many people were assassinated rather than captured, and on the allegation that the program was used to eliminate political enemies of the South Vietnamese government rather than actual Viet Cong operatives. These were legitimate concerns, and the evidence supporting them was substantial. But the torture question, the systematic abuse of people detained under the program, received less sustained attention, partly because it was harder to document from a distance and partly because the people subjected to it were Vietnamese, and their testimony was less available to American audiences. The napalm, the defoliants, the chemical herbicides that were sprayed across hundreds of thousands of acres of South Vietnamese landscape as part of the effort to deny the enemy cover and food were subjects of considerable protest in the United States, but relatively limited official acknowledgement of their human costs. Agent Orange, the most widely used of the herbicides, contained a contaminant called dioxin, which is among the most toxic substances that chemistry can produce. The relationship between dioxin exposure and a range of serious health conditions, including cancers and neurological disorders, was known in the scientific literature during the years the spraying was occurring, and the information was available to the officials making the decisions about whether to continue the program. The program continued. The Vietnamese civilians and the American veterans who were exposed to Agent Orange did not know what they were being exposed to in most cases, and they did not know what to attribute their subsequent health problems to. The American veterans who began developing unusual patterns of illness in the decades after the war were, for many years, told by the Veterans Administration that there was insufficient evidence to connect their conditions to herbicide exposure. The legal and bureaucratic battles over compensation stretched across decades. The Vietnamese victims of the spraying, who lived in the areas that were treated, whose children were born with the kinds of birth defects that dioxin exposure produces, received no compensation and very little acknowledgement for many years. The spraying covered something in the range of 4.5 million acres of Vietnamese land over roughly a decade of the program's operation. The civilian casualty figures for the Vietnam War are one of the most consistently uncertain and contested numbers in the conflict's statistics, which is itself a significant fact. In a war that was saturated with data, that produced body counts and Hamlet ratings and infiltration estimates and sortie counts and ammunition expenditure figures in quantities that overwhelmed the analytical capacity of the institutions trying to use them, the most fundamental number, the number of civilian Vietnamese who died as a result of the conflict, was one that no official body ever attempted to count systematically. The estimates that historians have produced range from roughly 1 million to more than 2 million, with the uncertainty reflecting not statistical imprecision, but the basic absence of any attempt to collect the underlying data. The deaths were not recorded. The villages that were bombed, the hamlets that were burned, the paddy fields that were sprayed, produced deaths that were not entered in any ledger, deaths that were not subject to any inquiry. Deaths that simply became part of the landscape of the war and were absorbed into the general category of what the war cost. The B-52 bombing campaigns, which were the largest application of air power in the history of warfare up to that point, represent perhaps the most extreme expression of the gap between the war as presented and the war as experienced. The strategic bombing conducted under Operation Rolling Thunder and its successors was presented to the public as a precision enterprise, as the careful and calibrated application of air power against specific military targets. The reality was that B-52 sorties dropped enormous quantities of bombs across enormous areas of Vietnamese and Cambodian and Laotian territory, and the accuracy of the strikes, measured against the complexity of the targets and the nature of the terrain, was far lower than the briefings suggested. The bombs fell in grids, in patterns designed to saturate a designated area rather than to hit specific structures or personnel. The targets were often designated on the basis of intelligence estimates rather than confirmed enemy presence, and the intelligence estimates were themselves products of the same pressured, incentivized reporting system that produced inflated body counts and optimistic Hamlet ratings. The bombing of Cambodia is a specific case that deserves particular attention because it was, for a period of more than a year, entirely secret. Operation Menu, which began in March of 1969, involved B-52 strikes against targets in Cambodia along the Vietnamese border, conducted without the knowledge of the American Congress, without public acknowledgement, and with falsified records designed to conceal the strikes from anyone who might question them. The Nixon administration decided to bomb Cambodia, a nominally neutral country, without telling anyone outside a small circle of senior officials, and the military officers responsible for implementing the strikes were given instructions about how to falsify the mission reports so that the bombs appeared in the official record to have fallen on Vietnam. This is not a conspiracy theory or a post-war reconstruction. It is a documented fact established by congressional investigations in the early 1970s. The falsification was systematic, and it was conducted at the instruction of senior officials, not as an unauthorized action by lower-level officers. The secrecy of the Cambodian bombing is significant not only as a legal and political matter, but as an indicator of how completely the institutional constraints on military action had eroded by the late 1960s. The decision to bomb a neutral country without congressional authorization or public acknowledgement was a decision to remove the action entirely from any democratic oversight, and the officers who implemented the decision did so in a way that actively obstructed the oversight mechanism by falsifying the records. The people who might have objected, who might have raised legal or ethical questions, were not given the opportunity to do so because they were not told what was happening. The decision was made by a small group at the top and executed by people who were following orders, and the falsification of the records was itself an order that people followed. The My Lai massacre of March 1968 is probably the single event from the Vietnam War that is most commonly cited as evidence that something had gone deeply wrong with the American military effort. It is also in some ways a misleading example, because the way it has been discussed tends to frame it as an aberration, as the product of a small number of psychologically disturbed individuals operating outside normal military parameters, when the evidence suggests that it was better understood as an extreme expression of practices that were, if not normal, at least not exceptional. The massacre of the civilian population of the village of My Lai by soldiers of Charlie Company 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry, involved the killing of between 347 and 504 people, according to different estimates, including women, children, and elderly men who presented no threat to the soldiers doing the killing. The event was not reported by anyone in the military chain of command who witnessed it. The after-action report filed by the commanding officer, Captain Ernest Medina, listed 128 enemy killed in action with no mention of civilian casualties. The helicopters that flew over the village during the operation, whose crews could see what was happening on the ground, reported back through their chain of command without the report triggering any investigation. The event was known about, in general terms, by a number of people in the military who said nothing, and it did not become public until a soldier who had not been present, Ronald Riddenhauer, sent letters to members of Congress and the Pentagon in March of 1969, more than a year after the event, based on accounts he had heard from participants. The subsequent investigation and court-martial proceedings, which resulted in the conviction of only one person, Lieutenant William Calley, and his eventual parole, are a separate story. The point is the year of silence, the year in which hundreds of people knew or suspected that a mass killing of civilians had occurred and said nothing because the system had no channel for receiving that kind of information and no incentive for anyone to create one. The internal studies that the military and the civilian leadership commissioned during the war, studies that were designed to assess honestly whether the strategy was working and what the actual conditions on the ground were, almost uniformly produced conclusions that were more pessimistic than the public reporting. The study commissioned by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara in 1967, which became known as the Pentagon Papers after Daniel Ellsberg leaked it to the press in 1971, was perhaps the most comprehensive of these internal assessments. It was a historical analysis of decision-making about Vietnam reaching back to the Truman administration, compiled by analysts in the Defense Department who had access to classified documents, and its conclusions were stark. The study found that the United States had been systematically deceiving itself and the public about the war's progress for decades, that the decisions that escalated the conflict were made in the face of intelligence assessments that predicted they would not achieve their stated objectives, and that the gap between public optimism and private pessimism had been constant and was understood at the highest levels of the civilian and military leadership. The decision to keep the study secret rather than use its findings to adjust the strategy or inform the public was itself a decision made within the system the study was criticizing, and it was entirely consistent with how the system operated. The information was produced, filed, and not acted upon. The classified label ensured that it could not reach the public debate that might have generated pressure for change. The officials who had access to it continued to make public statements that contradicted it. This was not hypocrisy in the ordinary sense, in which people say things they know to be false for personal advantage. It was something more systematic, in which the existence of two simultaneous and contradictory bodies of knowledge, one public and optimistic and one classified and pessimistic, had become a normal feature of the institution's operation, and the people navigating between them had long since ceased to experience the contradiction as disturbing. The reporters who covered the war in Vietnam were, on the whole, more willing to report what they saw than the institutional press of previous American wars had been, and the photographs and footage they produced did eventually shift public understanding in significant ways. But there were systematic limits on what the press could report, limits that operated not primarily through censorship, which was relatively light compared to previous wars, but through access, through the structure of the press briefings in Saigon that became known as the 5 o'clock follies, and through the social and professional pressures on reporters who deviated too far from the official narrative. The 5 o'clock follies were the daily military press briefings held in Saigon, and they were the primary source of daily news about the war's progress for most American outlets. The briefings presented statistics, sorties flown, enemy killed, roads secured. They used maps with colored overlays. They were delivered by officers who had not been in the field. and who were presenting information that had traveled through the same pressured reporting chain that produced the inflated body counts and optimistic Hamlet ratings. Reporters who had been in the field, who had seen operations that the briefings described differently from how they had unfolded, could ask questions. The questions were answered with more statistics. The gap between the briefing and the field was understood by every reporter who worked in Vietnam for any length of time, and it was reported. But the daily briefing continued to be the source of the daily story, because the daily story needed daily facts, and the daily facts were what the briefing provided. The reporters who described the war most honestly, whose work most accurately reflected the experience of the soldiers in the field, were not the ones who spent their time in Saigon. They were the ones who went out with the units, who walked the same trails and slept in the same mud and heard the same sounds in the night. Their work was more visceral and more accurate, but it was also episodic, and the episodic accurate report of a particular engagement or a particular unit was always absorbed into the larger narrative produced by the daily briefings, the official statements, the presidential addresses, which maintained a level of optimism that the episodic reports contradicted without ever quite dislodging. The anti-war movement in the United States is generally understood, in retrospect, as having been morally correct about the war's fundamental problems, but its relationship to the soldiers fighting the war was complicated in ways that are often glossed over. The soldiers who returned from Vietnam encountered a public that had divided in rough terms between people who opposed the war and sometimes expressed that opposition in terms that were hostile to the soldiers, and people who supported the war but often had very limited understanding of what the soldiers were actually experiencing. The genuine understanding of what the war had been like from the perspective of the men who fought it was largely absent from public discourse while the war was ongoing, and it took decades for the veterans' accounts to accumulate into anything like a comprehensive picture. The Veterans Administration, which was responsible for providing medical care and benefits to returning veterans, was not equipped for the scale of need that the Vietnam War generated. The physical casualties, the amputees, the men with traumatic brain injuries, the men exposed to Agent Orange were processed through a system that was understaffed, underfunded, and not particularly well disposed toward the Vietnam veteran, who had, in the cultural imagination of the period, acquired some of the stigma of the war's unpopularity. The psychological casualties were even less well served, because the condition now known as post-traumatic stress disorder was not recognized as a distinct diagnostic category until 1980, and the veterans who were experiencing its symptoms in the years immediately after the war were treated inconsistently, sometimes effectively and often not, by a system that did not have a clear framework for understanding what was wrong with them. The suicide rate among Vietnam veterans in the years and decades after the war is another number that is difficult to establish precisely and whose significance is disputed, but the available evidence suggests that the war produced psychological damage that killed a substantial number of people well after the shooting stopped. The estimates of post-war suicide among Vietnam veterans range widely, with some suggesting that the number of veterans who died by suicide in the years after the war exceeded the number who died in combat, though this claim is contested. What is not contested is that the psychological consequences of service in Vietnam were severe for a significant fraction of the veterans, that those consequences were undertreated, and that the institutional response to them was inadequate. The question of who bore the burden of service in Vietnam is one that received relatively little attention at the time and has received more in subsequent decades. The draft system that produced most of the American soldiers who served in Vietnam was not a system of universal obligation. It was a system riddled with deferments, with legal and practical mechanisms for avoiding service that were far more available to men with money, education, and social connections than to men without those things. College deferments kept most men who could get into college out of the draft for 4 years, and graduate school deferments extended the protection further. Occupational deferments protected men in certain types of work. Connections to draft board members, the ability to afford medical examinations that might produce disqualifying findings, access to lawyers and advisors who knew how to navigate the system, All of these things were resources that the affluent had and the poor did not. The result was that the Vietnam War was fought disproportionately by men who were poor, who were black, who were Hispanic, who were rural, who had not gone to college, who lacked the connections or resources to avoid service. This was not a hidden fact. It was understood at the time by those who chose to look at it, but it was not a prominent feature of the public narrative of the war, which tended to present the combat soldier in terms that obscured his demographic specificity, that made him representative rather than typical of a particular demographic stratum. The men who designed the draft system, who administered it, who benefited from its exemptions, were largely the same men who designed and administered the war, and the overlap was not accidental. The air war, measured in tonnage dropped, exceeded the total tonnage dropped in all of World War II by the time the conflict ended. This is a fact that appears in histories of the war without always being given the weight it deserves. The United States dropped more than 7 million tons of bombs on Southeast Asia over the course of the conflict, and the military effectiveness of this expenditure, measured against its stated objectives, was limited. The bombing did not stop the flow of supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which continued to deliver enough material to maintain the enemy's operational capacity throughout the war, despite continuous interdiction efforts. The bombing did not break the enemy's will to continue fighting, which was assessed repeatedly as being near its breaking point, and which never, in fact, broke. The bombing did not pacify the countryside or reduce support for the insurgency among the rural population, and there was evidence, which was produced internally and not widely circulated, that it had the opposite effect, that the bombing increased hostility to the South Vietnamese government and its American supporters among the people it fell on. The Tet Offensive of January 1968 is the event most commonly cited as the turning point in American public opinion about the war, the moment when the gap between the official optimism and the reality of the conflict became impossible to maintain. The offensive, in which coordinated Viet Cong attacks were launched simultaneously against more than 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam, including a brief assault on the American embassy compound in Saigon, was a military defeat for the Viet Cong. The attacks were repelled, the attackers suffered enormous casualties, the Viet Cong infrastructure in many parts of the country was badly damaged by the losses. By the metrics the military had been using to measure progress, Tet should have been a victory. General Westmoreland said that it was a victory, that the enemy had exposed itself and been destroyed, that the offensive had accelerated the war's progress toward the crossover point. The public did not believe him, and in this case the public was closer to correct than the general, not because the military assessment of enemy losses was wrong, but because the military assessment was missing the larger point. An enemy that had been described repeatedly as being on the verge of collapse had just demonstrated the capacity to launch the largest coordinated military operation of the entire war. Whatever the tactical result, the strategic message of Tet was that the official picture of the war's progress had been wrong. The military requested another 206,000 troops after Tet, bringing the total requested American commitment to over 700,000. This request was eventually denied, and it was the denial that marked the real turning point in the civilian leadership's commitment to the war. President Lyndon Johnson, who had staked his presidency and his Great Society domestic agenda on the premise that the war could be won without open-ended escalation, announced in March of 1968 that he would not seek re-election, that he was withdrawing from the race to devote himself full-time to the pursuit of peace. The announcement was the closest thing to an official acknowledgement that the strategy had failed that the Johnson administration produced, though it was not framed in those terms. It was framed as a gesture of self-sacrifice, as a leader putting the national interest ahead of his personal political ambitions. It was also the quiet admission of a man who had been told, by the people whose judgment he respected, that the war could not be won at any cost he was prepared to pay. The Paris peace talks that followed Johnson's announcement and that continued through the Nixon administration were themselves a prolonged exercise in the gap between official purpose and actual purpose. The negotiations were conducted in the presence of the ongoing war, which continued to kill people at rates that fluctuated but never dropped to zero, while the negotiating parties argued about the shape of the table and the order in which various political concessions would be acknowledged. The talks produced an agreement in January of 1973, the Paris Peace Accords, which the Nixon administration presented as peace with honor, as the achievement of American objectives in Vietnam through diplomatic rather than military means. The agreement provided for the withdrawal of American troops, the release of American prisoners of war, and a ceasefire that was understood by everyone involved to be temporary. It did not provide for the withdrawal of North Vietnamese troops already in the South, which meant that the forces that would ultimately determine the outcome of the conflict remained in place. The period between the signing of the Paris Peace Accords in January 1973 and the fall of Saigon in April 1975 was a period in which the South Vietnamese government, stripped of American combat support, attempted to survive against an adversary that had not been defeated, had not been persuaded, had not been pacified, had simply agreed to wait while the Americans left. The South Vietnamese army fought, in some cases with genuine effectiveness, and in others with the fragmentation and collapse that the American advisors had always feared. The North Vietnamese army, rested and resupplied, and operating from a strategic position that the departure of American forces had fundamentally improved, resumed offensive operations in early 1975. The South Vietnamese response was, in several critical areas, a collapse rather than a defense, and the collapse accelerated into a rout that the fall of Saigon on April 30, 1975 completed. The images of the evacuation from the roof of the American embassy, the helicopters lifting off with people clinging to the skids, the crowds at the embassy gate, the burning of documents, were broadcast live and represented in their visual compression, something that the entire preceding decade of official optimism had been working to prevent anyone from seeing. They were not misunderstood images. They were images of what they showed, which was the end of a commitment made on false premises, sustained by false reports, and concluded with the same combination of institutional self-protection and strategic confusion that had characterized its entire prosecution. The men who had built the policy, who had refined it, who had defended it in public while doubting it in private, were mostly no longer in their positions by the time the helicopters lifted off. They had moved on to other things. The soldiers who had carried the policy in their bodies, in their memories, in the particular way the war had rearranged their relationship to the world, were watching from wherever they had ended up after their rotations in living rooms across the country, and what they saw confirmed things they had understood for years. The accounting that followed, the investigations and memoirs and oral histories and declassifications that gradually assembled a more complete picture of what had happened in Vietnam, produced a record that was, in its totality, more damning than anything that had appeared during the war. The systematic deception, the inflated statistics, the falsified reports, the suppressed assessments, the deliberate misrepresentation of progress and cost, the decisions made by people who knew the strategy was not working but continued to advocate for it, the bureaucratic mechanisms by which uncomfortable truths were absorbed and neutralized before reaching the level where they might produce change, all of this emerged over the course of years and decades into a historical record that was available in principle to anyone who chose to consult it. The question of what the soldiers who fought in Vietnam had been fighting for is one that those soldiers addressed in their own ways, in memoirs and interviews and at the wall, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington that was designed by Maya Lin and completed in 1982. The wall lists the names of 58,281 Americans who died in the conflict, and it is designed so that you can see your own reflection in the black granite as you read the names. And the effect of this design is to place the viewer inside the memorial rather than outside it, to refuse the comfortable distance of observation. It does not say what the war meant. It does not offer an interpretation. It offers names, and the names are the weight of what happened, the specific, irreducible fact of individual deaths accumulated into a number that is both comprehensible and overwhelming. The Vietnamese casualties, which numbered in the millions and were distributed across both sides of the conflict and the civilian population, have no equivalent memorial in the United States. The Vietnamese dead are, from the perspective of most Americans who think about the war at all, an abstraction, a number read from a history book that does not resolve into faces or names or the specific textures of individual lives. This is not a moral observation. It is an observation about the nature of the public memory that the war produced, a memory organized around American experience and American loss, with the Vietnamese, who suffered the greatest portion of the damage, present in it primarily as context. The mechanisms that produced the systematic misrepresentation of the war, the pressured reporting chains, the metric substitutions, the institutional disincentives for honest assessment, were not unique to Vietnam. They were features of a large bureaucratic institution operating under political pressure to show results, and they would appear in variants and variations in subsequent American military engagements. The lessons that the institutional military drew from Vietnam, the formal lessons documented in after-action reviews and doctrine revisions, focused heavily on operational and tactical matters, on fire support coordination and air-ground integration and the organization of forces. The lesson about what happens when the reporting system is structured to reward optimism rather than accuracy received less sustained institutional attention, because that lesson was harder to implement as a doctrinal change, and because implementing it would require the institution to acknowledge, in a formal and lasting way, what had gone wrong. The soldiers who came back from Vietnam and the soldiers who stayed in the army and built its post-Vietnam institutional culture carried the experience of the war inside them in different ways. Some of them carried it as a set of lessons learned, as professional knowledge about what not to do, as the foundation of a determination to rebuild the institution into something that would not repeat the failures. Others carried it as a wound, as the specific damage that comes from having been asked to perform an impossible task in the name of a purpose that was never clearly defined, and from having performed it anyway at significant personal cost, and from having found upon return that the society that had sent them did not particularly want to hear about what it had been like. The institutional wound and the personal wound were different things, but they shared a common origin in the same fundamental failure, the failure to align what was said about the war with what the war actually was. The last American combat troops left Vietnam in March of 1973, following the Paris Peace Accords. American military advisors and support personnel remained for another 2 years, until the fall of Saigon made their continued presence impossible. The American prisoners of war returned in Operation Homecoming, the last of them arriving in February 1973. And their return was one of the few unambiguously positive events of the war's conclusion, the one moment at which official statements and human reality were aligned without reservation. The men who came back had been held for years in conditions that were, in many cases, genuinely brutal, and their survival and return was a real thing. Whatever else about the war had turned out not to be real. The war in Vietnam officially ended for the United States with the fall of Saigon on April 30, 1975, when North Vietnamese tanks rolled through the gates of the presidential palace and the last American personnel were evacuated by helicopter. For the Vietnamese, the war, which they called the American War, was succeeded by years of difficult reconstruction, by the killing fields of Cambodia next door, by a border war with China, by the continued suffering of a population that had been at war continuously since before most of its members were born. For the American veterans, the war ended at different times and in different ways for different people, and for some it has not yet ended in any complete sense. The official end of American involvement did not produce a reckoning of the kind that might have been expected, a serious institutional accounting of what had gone wrong and why. There were congressional investigations, there were memoirs, there were books and films, and eventually a cultural processing of the war that filled libraries and created an entire genre of American art. But the institutional accounting, the formal investigation into how and why the reporting system had produced so much false information, how and why the civilian and military leadership had continued to advocate for a strategy they had private reason to doubt, how and why the decision-making process had been so consistently insulated from the accurate information that might have altered its outputs. This accounting was partial, and it was slow, and it was conducted in ways that allowed the institution to absorb the criticism without fundamentally changing the mechanisms that had produced the failures. The soldiers who were still in Vietnam in the final months, as the South Vietnamese government collapsed and the North Vietnamese army advanced, were witnesses to something that the official narrative of the war had insisted, until very near the end, was not going to happen. They watched the army they had been training dissolve, watched the government they had been supporting fail, watched the country they had been protecting fall. Some of them had been in Vietnam multiple times, had spent years of their lives in a country that was now, in the space of weeks, transformed beyond recognition. Some of them had Vietnamese wives, Vietnamese friends, Vietnamese colleagues who were now in danger from a government that was going to remember who had worked with the Americans. The evacuation was chaotic and incomplete. Not everyone got out. The ones who did not get out faced consequences that varied from difficult to lethal. The war produced in its aftermath a category of person who had not existed before in the same form. The American veteran who had fought in a war that was widely understood to have been a mistake, who had been asked to kill people and had done so, who had watched friends die, who had been changed by the experience in ways that were permanent and in many cases invisible to anyone who had not been through it, and who returned to a country that was not sure how to regard them. The ambivalence was not always expressed as hostility. It was often expressed as silence, as a collective determination not to examine too closely what the war had been and what had been done in it, because the examination was uncomfortable and the implications were difficult. The silence was a choice made by a society that had decided, at some level, that living with the war's ambiguity was preferable to resolving it, that the unexamined wound was easier to manage than the examined one. The veterans carried the wound. The society carried the ambiguity. The war, in the sense of its consequences and its unresolved meanings, did not end when the last helicopter lifted off from the embassy roof. The final accounting of what the United States spent in Vietnam, in money and lives and political capital and institutional credibility, is a number that can be stated with some precision in some of its components and not at all in others. Roughly 58,000 Americans died. Roughly 300,000 were wounded. The financial cost in nominal dollars was somewhere above $140 billion, and in inflation-adjusted terms, far higher. The political cost, the erosion of public trust in government and military institutions that the war produced, was real and lasting, though it is difficult to measure. The cost to Vietnam itself, in lives and in the destruction of the landscape and the social fabric, was enormous, and it was paid primarily by people who had no meaningful input into the decisions that imposed it. The war continued in Vietnam after the American departure, in the form of the North Vietnamese consolidation of the country, in the form of the re-education camps where former South Vietnamese officials and military officers and anyone associated with the American presence were sent for periods that ranged from months to years, in the form of the boat people who fled the country in the late 1970s and early 1980s, in the form of the poverty and isolation that followed from the American trade embargo that remained in effect until 1994. The war's effects persisted in the soil, which still contained unexploded ordnance that continued to kill and maim Vietnamese farmers decades after the last American left. The war's effects persisted in the bodies of people exposed to Agent Orange, in the elevated rates of certain cancers and birth defects that continued to appear in the affected populations for generations. The war did not end cleanly. It trailed off into consequences that were absorbed by the landscape and the population and the institution of the American military in ways that are still working themselves out. The body count at the end of the war, the final official tally of enemy killed in action over the entire course of the American involvement, was a number that the military had assembled from a decade of reports generated by a system known to be unreliable, compiled by units operating under incentives to overstate, and verified by no independent mechanism. It was a very large number. It was almost certainly wrong. The war ended anyway.